This story is based on true events. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you when you were alone? That prickling sensation at the back of your neck, the one you can never quite shake, even when you tell yourself it's nothing. Statistics say that nearly 50% of people have experienced this inexplicable sense of being observed in their own homes. But what if it wasn't just a feeling? What if something or someone truly was there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself? This story delves into that primal fear, the one that gnaws at the edge of your consciousness when you're alone at night. It's about the thin line between imagination and reality, and how sometimes that line is far blurrier than we'd like to believe. The tale I'm about to share is one that haunted me for years, a story that still makes me glance over my shoulder in the dead of night. It's a story about isolation, dread, and the kind of terror that sinks its claws into you and never lets go. The house had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Perched on a hill at the edge of town, it loomed over the landscape like a dark sentinel, its windows black and empty, as if the house itself was watching, waiting. No one in town ever talked about it, and whenever I asked my parents, they would quickly change the subject, their faces growing pale. But the house fascinated me. I couldn't help it. There was something about its silent presence that called to me, like a whisper in the back of my mind that I couldn't ignore. It was the summer of my 17th year when I finally decided to explore the house. My friends had dared me, of course, but deep down, I wanted to go. I wanted to see what was inside, to understand why it had been left to rot for so many years. So, one hot August afternoon, I found myself standing at the base of the hill, looking up at the house. The sky was a clear, endless blue, but as I approached the house, a heavy cloud seemed to settle over the place. The air grew thick, almost oppressive, and I felt a strange chill despite the heat. The front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The door creaked loudly, echoing through the empty halls, and I stepped inside. The interior was dark, the air stale and heavy with dust. I could barely make out the shapes of old furniture, covered in white sheets that had yellowed with age. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards under my feet. As I moved deeper into the house, the sense of being watched grew stronger. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing there. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at me, making my skin crawl. I passed through a narrow hallway, lined with old, faded photographs. The faces in the pictures were blurred, distorted, as if they had been smeared by time. I paused to examine one of them, squinting in the dim light. It was a family portrait, the kind you might see in any old house. A man, a woman, and 2 children. But something was wrong. The faces were twisted, their expressions frozen in grotesque masks of fear. And then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing behind them, barely visible, but there. It was tall, impossibly thin, its features obscured by darkness. I blinked, and the figure was gone, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. I hurried down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. I found myself in a large, decaying living room. The furniture was old, ancient even, and the wallpaper was peeling off the walls in long strips. An enormous, cracked mirror hung above the fireplace, its surface clouded with dust. I walked over to it, compelled by some force I couldn't explain. As I wiped the dust away with my sleeve, my reflection stared back at me, but something was off. My face looked pale, almost sickly, and my eyes were wide, filled with fear. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just the dust, just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I turned to leave, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of the room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the shadows, was the same tall, thin figure I had seen in the photograph. It was watching me, its eyes glinting in the dim light. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, it lunged at me. I stumbled back, my mind screaming in terror. I turned and ran, the sound of my own panicked breathing filling my ears. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps growing louder, closer. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I tore through the house, my heart pounding in my chest, my vision blurred by fear. Finally, I burst through the front door and into the blinding sunlight. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the hill, my lungs burning, my legs trembling. When I finally dared to look back, the house was just as it had always been, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew something was in there, something that was watching, waiting, and I wasn't the first to encounter it. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, looming in the shadows, its eyes piercing through the darkness. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the house was old and creepy, and I had let my imagination get the best of me. But the truth was harder to ignore. Something had chased me out of that house, something that wasn't human. The next day, I tried to go about my usual routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak in the floorboards, every rustle of the leaves outside, made my heart skip a beat. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that tall, thin figure lurking in the shadows. By the time evening came, I was a nervous wreck. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise coming from outside my window. It was faint at first, just a soft scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the direction of the hill, where the old house stood. My heart pounded in my chest as I got out of bed and crept to the window. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the landscape. I scanned the yard, my eyes searching for any sign of movement. At first, I saw nothing, just the usual shadows cast by the trees. But then, something caught my eye. At the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, was a figure, tall, thin, and motionless. It was standing at the base of the hill, its face hidden in the shadows, but I knew it was the same figure I had seen in the house. The Watcher. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring at me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them, boring into me, cold and relentless. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling. I wanted to scream, to wake up my parents, but the words caught in my throat. I was paralyzed with fear. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that figure, but eventually it began to move. Slowly, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees at the base of the hill. I watched it go, my heart pounding, until it was completely out of sight. Only then did I collapse onto my bed, my body shaking with terror. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had all been a bad dream, but the memory of that figure was too vivid, too real. I knew I couldn't ignore it. Something had followed me from that house, and it wasn't going to stop. I needed answers. I spent the next few days researching the history of the house, digging through old records at the local library. What I found sent chills down my spine. The house had once belonged to a wealthy family, the Mortons, who had mysteriously disappeared over 50 years ago. According to the reports, the family had been last seen at a town event, but when neighbors noticed they hadn't been out in a few days, they went to check on them. The house was empty, no sign of a struggle, no note, nothing. It was as if the family had simply vanished. But the most disturbing part was the rumors that circulated afterward. People in town whispered that the Mortons had been involved in something dark, something evil. There were stories of strange rituals, of sightings of a tall, shadowy figure near the house. Some claimed the house was cursed, that anyone who entered it would be doomed to suffer the same fate as the Mortons. I tried to dismiss these stories as superstition, but they struck too close to what I had experienced. The Watcher, the figure I had seen, was real, and it had taken an interest in me. As the days passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I could feel its presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I started seeing the figure everywhere, in the corner of my eye when I was alone in my room, in the reflection of mirrors, even in my dreams. It was always there, silent and patient, watching. I became obsessed with finding a way to get rid of it. I visited old bookstores, searching for anything that might help. Books on the occult, exorcisms, anything that could explain what was happening to me. But nothing I found offered any real answers. I was alone in this, and I was running out of time. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my room. They were slow, deliberate, and they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, my heart racing, as the doorknob began to turn. The door creaked open, and there it was, the Watcher standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It was as if the very air had turned to ice, freezing me in place. The Watcher stepped into the room, its movements slow and unnatural, like it was gliding across the floor. It stood over my bed, its face just inches from mine. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, see the darkness swirling in its eyes. For what felt like an eternity, it just stared at me, its expression unreadable. Then, without warning, it leaned closer and whispered something in a voice that wasn't human. The words were garbled, incomprehensible, but they filled me with a dread so deep it felt like my soul was being crushed. And then it was gone. Just like that, it vanished, leaving me gasping for air, drenched in sweat. I lay there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the words it had whispered kept echoing in my mind, like a curse I couldn't shake. The next day, I knew I had to leave. Whatever the Watcher was, it had marked me, and I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed a bag, told my parents I needed to get away for a while, and drove as far as I could, hoping to outrun whatever had followed me. But deep down, I knew it was futile. The Watcher wasn't bound by distance. It wasn't tied to the house. It was tied to me. Months passed, and I kept moving, never staying in one place for too long. I thought I might be safe, that I had escaped its grasp. But then, one night, as I was lying in bed in a cheap motel room, I felt it again. That cold, suffocating presence. I opened my eyes, and there it was, standing at the foot of my bed, watching. This time, I didn't run. I couldn't. It had found me, and I knew it always would. The Watcher wasn't just a ghost or a demon. It was something far older, far more powerful, and it had chosen me. Now, I live in constant fear, always looking over my shoulder, knowing it's out there, waiting. I've tried to warn others, but no one believes me. They think I'm crazy, that it's all in my head. But I know the truth. So, if you ever feel like you're being watched, like something is lurking in the shadows, don't ignore it. Because once the Watcher sets its sights on you, there's no escape, and you'll never be alone again. This story is based on true events. Growing up in a small town nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, I was no stranger to eerie tales and superstitions. My family had lived in that area for generations, and the old folks would often gather around the fire, sharing stories of hauntings, cursed places, and spirits that roamed the woods at night. As a child, I listened with wide eyes, half believing, half dismissing these stories as the fanciful exaggerations of the elderly. But there was one story, one dark chapter in my family's history that was never spoken of directly. only hinted at in hushed whispers when they thought I wasn't listening. It wasn't until I was much older, well into my 20s, that I began to understand what had happened. By then, my parents had passed away, and the old house, with all its secrets, had been left to me. I moved back after years of city living, seeking a quiet place to clear my mind and perhaps reconnect with the roots I had long ignored. The house was exactly as I remembered it, large, with creaking floorboards and walls lined with portraits of long-dead relatives whose stern faces seemed to follow me wherever I went. But it was the road that led to the house, a narrow, winding path cutting through the dense forest, that held the most unsettling memories. There were stories about that road, stories that I had always dismissed as nothing more than local folklore. But after what happened, I can't dismiss them any longer. It started one night, just after I had moved in. I was driving home from town, the sun long gone and the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The road was pitch black, the trees on either side casting long, twisted shadows across the path. As I drove, I felt a strange sense of unease, a prickling at the back of my neck that made me check the rearview mirror repeatedly. The road seemed longer than usual, as if it stretched on endlessly, the familiar bends and turns becoming foreign, almost menacing. And then I saw it, just up ahead, in the distance, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move. It was just standing there, motionless, staring at me. As I got closer, I could make out more details. It was a man, dressed in old, tattered clothes, his face pale and drawn, with eyes that seemed to glimmer in the darkness. I honked the horn, hoping to scare him off, but he didn't budge. Instead, he lifted one hand and pointed directly at me. There was something in that gesture, something so deliberate and accusatory, that it sent a chill down my spine. I rolled down the window, about to shout at him, but as soon as I did, the air around me seemed to change. It grew colder, unnaturally so, and the forest around me fell deathly silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, nothing, just an oppressive, eerie silence. The man's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt as if he was looking straight into my soul. There was something deeply unsettling in his gaze, an emptiness, a void that seemed to pull me in. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to get out of the car, to walk towards him, as if he was calling to me. But something held me back, some instinct buried deep within me that screamed at me to stay put. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, staring at the man. But then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. He didn't move, didn't fade away. One moment he was there, and the next, he wasn't. The road ahead was empty, the shadows shifting back to their usual places as if nothing had happened. Shaken, I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but it was fleeting. As I got out of the car and looked back down the road, I thought I saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees, a shadow slipping back into the darkness. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over in my mind. Who was that man? Why had he been on that road? And why had he disappeared like that? My rational mind tried to come up with explanations. Maybe he was a drifter, maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. Something sinister. The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. Every time I drove down that road, I felt a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. But no matter how much I tried to push the experience to the back of my mind, I couldn't escape the sense that something was terribly wrong. Then, one evening, I found an old box in the attic. It was covered in dust, hidden away behind a pile of forgotten belongings. Inside were photographs, letters, and a journal that had belonged to my great-grandfather. As I flipped through the pages, I found entries that spoke of a dark road and a curse that had plagued our family for generations. The details were vague, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand, but one entry stood out. They found him on the road, dead eyes staring into nothing. The same road where my father saw the stranger. They say he was cursed, that the man was not of this world. I've seen him too, standing there in the dark, pointing, always pointing. I fear my time is near. The words sent a chill through me. My great-grandfather had seen the same figure, the same man on the road, and others before him, too. This wasn't just a ghost story. It was something real, something that had haunted my family for generations. The journal went on to describe how the sightings would become more frequent, the figure appearing closer and closer to the house until, eventually, tragedy struck. It didn't explain what the man wanted or why he was tormenting our family, but the implication was clear. Those who saw him didn't live long afterward. I was terrified. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept that I was caught up in some ancient curse. But the evidence was there, staring me in the face. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know where to start. The man had appeared to me once. What if he came again? What if this time he didn't disappear? That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the journal, about the figure on the road, and about the possibility that my fate was sealed. The house creaked and groaned around me, the old wood settling in the cool night air, but every sound made me jump. My heart raced, and I found myself listening intently, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. And then I heard it, a soft, distant tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was coming from outside, from the direction of the road. I got out of bed, my legs trembling, and walked to the window. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind clouds, but I could just make out a figure standing at the edge of the yard. It was him, the man from the road. He was closer now, much closer, standing just beyond the fence that separated the yard from the road. He was facing the house, his head tilted slightly to the side as if he was listening, waiting. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him. He lifted his hand again, pointing directly at my window. A wave of cold terror washed over me. I wanted to turn away, to hide, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring into those dark, hollow eyes that seemed to see right through me. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, pointing, as if accusing me of something. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, the figure turned and walked back towards the road. He disappeared into the trees, just like before, leaving me alone with my fear. I knew then that this wasn't over. He would come back, and each time he did, he would get closer. The journal had warned of this, how the figure would appear more frequently, how his presence would grow stronger, more menacing. I had no idea what he wanted, but I was terrified of finding out. I spent the next day in a haze of anxiety, jumping at every little noise, constantly looking over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the man was out there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment to strike. That evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't just sit around and wait for him to come for me. I had to do something, anything, to break the cycle. I gathered supplies, salt, candles, a Bible, anything I could think of that might protect me. I wasn't particularly religious, but at that moment, I was willing to try anything. As night fell, I prepared myself for whatever was to come. I drew a circle of salt around my bed, lit the candles, and sat with the Bible in my lap, my eyes fixed on the door. The house was eerily silent, the air thick with tension. I could feel it, the darkness closing in, the sense of impending doom. And then, just as I feared, the tapping began again. This time, It was louder, more insistent. I gripped the Bible tighter, my heart racing as I listened. The tapping grew closer, moving from outside to the walls of the house, then to the door of my bedroom. It stopped for a moment, and I held my breath, praying that it was over. But then the door creaked open, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his tall, gaunt figure filling the room with an oppressive darkness. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me. There was no escaping him, no hiding. He stepped forward, his hand still pointing, accusing. I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder and colder until my breath came out in visible puffs. He stopped just at the edge of the salt circle, his gaze unblinking, his expression unreadable. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in as the darkness deepened. I could feel the weight of his presence, crushing, suffocating. And then he spoke, his voice a low, rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words were barely audible, but they carried a weight that filled me with dread. "Your time is near." I woke up the next morning to a cold, grey dawn, the events of the night before lingering in my mind like a half-remembered nightmare. But it hadn't been a dream. The figure in the doorway, the chilling words he had spoken, they were all too real. I could still feel the lingering cold in the room, a reminder that whatever had haunted my ancestors was now coming for me. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that stress and isolation were playing tricks on my mind, but deep down I knew better. The signs were there, the oppressive silence that fell over the house at night, the strange icy drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, the feeling of being watched that never went away. I found myself avoiding the road as much as possible, taking detours through town or staying late at work just to avoid driving home after dark. But no matter where I went or what I did, the fear followed me. It was as if the curse had seeped into every part of my life, tainting even the smallest moments with a sense of impending doom. Then, one evening, as I was driving home from the store, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. I was taking a different route, one that bypassed the old road entirely, when I noticed a car pulled off to the side of the road. It was an old, beat-up sedan, its headlights flickering weakly in the dim light. Curious, I slowed down, thinking that maybe the driver needed help. But as I got closer, I saw that the car was empty, its doors wide open as if the occupants had left in a hurry. I pulled over and got out, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something unsettling about the scene, something that set my nerves on edge. The air around the car was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the forest on either side of the road seemed darker, more menacing than usual. As I approached the car, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the ground, just beside the open driver's door, was a series of footprints, leading away from the road and into the trees. They were large, almost inhumanly so, and they seemed to sink deeper into the ground than they should have, as if the person or thing that had made them was far heavier than it appeared. I stared at the footprints, my mind racing. The logical part of me wanted to believe that it was just some local prankster, that the car had broken down and the driver had gone to get help. But another part of me, the part that had seen the figure on the road and heard his chilling words, knew better. I hesitated for a moment, then followed the footprints into the trees. The air grew colder as I walked, the shadows lengthening around me. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot. I could feel my heart beating faster, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps as I pushed through the underbrush, the footprints leading me deeper into the woods. After what felt like hours, I came to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The windows were shattered, the door hanging off its hinges, but there was something about the place that made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, like a place that had been abandoned for a reason. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the cabin for any sign of life. As I approached the door, I noticed something scrawled across the wooden planks in what looked like dried blood. The words were barely legible, but I could make out a single phrase. "He is here." My stomach turned, and I took a step back, my mind racing. Who had written that? And who was he? The figure from the road? The one who had been haunting my family for generations? 1,000 questions raced through my mind, but before I could make sense of them, I heard a noise behind me, a soft rustling like someone or something moving through the trees. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was still, the shadows deepening as the sun dipped below the horizon. But I could feel it. Something was watching me, something that didn't belong in this world. Panic surged through me, and I turned back towards the cabin, my hand reaching for the door. But as I did, the door swung open on its own, revealing a dark, empty interior. The air inside was thick with the smell of mold and rot, and I could see the faint outline of furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. But there was something else too, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. In the center of the room, standing perfectly still, was a figure, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. It was the man from the road, the one who had been haunting my every step. He was here, in the cabin, waiting for me. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes. I could feel the weight of its gaze, the coldness radiating from its body, seeping into my bones. And then, without warning, it spoke. The voice was low, guttural, and filled with an ancient, malevolent hatred. It echoed through the cabin, filling the room with a sense of dread that I had never felt before. "You cannot escape." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was savoring the moment. I could see its face more clearly now, pale, almost skeletal, with eyes that burned with an unnatural light. There was something in those eyes, something that made me feel as if I was staring into the very heart of darkness. It reached out a hand, and I could feel the air grow colder, the shadows around me deepening. I knew that if it touched me, if it laid even a single finger on me, I would be lost. But I couldn't move, couldn't look away. It was as if the figure had me in its thrall, holding me in place with nothing but its gaze. And then, just as its hand was about to touch me, I heard a voice, a different voice, this one filled with urgency and fear. "Run!" The spell broke, and I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to get out. I turned and fled, crashing through the trees, the branches tearing at my clothes as I ran. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. I could hear the figure behind me, its footsteps echoing in the darkness, growing closer with each passing second. I don't know how I made it out of the woods, but somehow I did. I burst out onto the road, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, expecting to see the figure behind me, but the road was empty. The forest was silent, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. I got back into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in the safety of my house. But even then, the fear didn't leave me. The figure's words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape. I knew it would come for me again, that it was only a matter of time. The days turned into weeks, and I tried to go on with my life, but the sense of dread never left. I started seeing the figure everywhere, in the shadows of my house, in the corner of my eye, in the faces of strangers on the street. It was always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting. And then, one night, it happened. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I could feel the figure's presence, knew it was close. I closed my eyes, trying to shut it out, but the feeling only grew stronger. I heard a noise, a soft, scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. My heart skipped a beat, and I opened my eyes. The room was dark, the shadows deep, but I could see a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was him. The figure moved closer, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I could feel the coldness radiating from its body, the sense of malevolence that surrounded it like a shroud. It reached out a hand, and this time there was no escape. I was trapped, caught in its grip, unable to move or scream. The figure leaned closer, its face inches from mine. I could see the emptiness in its eyes, the darkness that consumed it. And then, in a voice that chilled me to the bone, it spoke. "Your time has come." The words echoed in my mind, filling me with a sense of hopelessness and despair. I knew then that there was no escaping the curse, no running from the darkness that had claimed my family for generations. The figure reached out, its hand cold and clammy as it touched my skin. I felt a jolt of pain, a searing heat that burned through my body, followed by a coldness so intense that it seemed to freeze my very soul. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nostrils. The room was bright, the sun streaming in through the windows. I could hear the faint beeping of machines, the distant murmur of voices. A nurse appeared at my side, her face kind and concerned. She told me that I had been found unconscious in my house, that a neighbor had heard a noise and called for help. They had found me on the floor, cold and unresponsive, but alive. I was alive, but something inside me had changed. The darkness that had haunted me for so long was gone, but it had left a mark, a deep, indelible scar on my soul. I could still feel the coldness, the emptiness that the figure had left behind, a reminder that I had come face to face with something far beyond human understanding. The doctors couldn't explain what had happened to me. They ran tests, asked questions, but I had no answers for them. I didn't tell them about the figure, about the curse that had haunted my family for generations. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. I was released from the hospital a few days later, but I knew that I could never go back to that house, never drive down that road again. The curse was gone, the figure no longer haunting me, but the memories remained. I could still see its eyes, still hear its voice in my mind. I sold the house and moved away, far from the mountains and the dark road that had been the source of so much fear and pain. I tried to start a new life, to forget what had happened, but the past has a way of holding on, of creeping back into your thoughts when you least expect it. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares. I wake up in a cold sweat, the figure's face looming over me, its voice echoing in my ears. I've tried to move on, to live a normal life, but I know that some things can never be forgotten. The road, the figure, the curse, they're all a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my being. I don't know if I'll ever truly escape them, but I've come to accept that some things are beyond explanation, beyond understanding. All I can do is try to live with the darkness, to keep it at bay, and hope that, one day, I'll find peace. But deep down, I know that the figure is still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next person to cross its path. And when that happens, the curse will begin again, because some things never truly die.